Well, people in Australia have certainly observed it and understand that there was a referendum and a great debate here about it. But I think the on balance judgment is it won't make anything like as much difference either way as people in the UK who still debate it imagine it will. So, for example, Australian companies are continuing their investment profile here in the UK. We're not seeing any reticence about investment by Australian companies in the UK. Equally, we're not seeing Australian companies think that suddenly there's going to be the opening of a whole new sort of nirvana of economic opportunity. So I would say from the time before June last year until now, there's been no perceptible change in the way Australian businesses approach the UK. We could, but it'll depend what the UK does much more in terms of domestic economic policies than whether it's in or out of the EU. Obviously, being in the EU, we essentially have no trade relationship with the UK itself. Our trade relationship is with the whole of the EU, and so it's done through Brussels. So when you leave the EU, presuming you leave the customs union, then our trade relationship will develop bilaterally. And we'd like to see as soon as possible a free trade agreement negotiated between Australia and the UK. So your pattern of trade may change a little bit, because instead of you having a preferential trade arrangement with the 27 other members of the EU, you may still have a free trade agreement with them, but you might be able to negotiate preferential trade arrangements with other countries like Australia, New Zealand, the US, China, and so on. And if you do that, well, that won't just boost trade with those countries and will divert some of your trade away from the EU and to those countries, but it will stimulate more investment as well, so in both directions. So this all presupposes, though, that you run in this country attractive economic policies to international investors, because, you know, whether you're in the EU or you're out of the EU, if you decide to adopt a lot of economic policies in the UK which are inimical to the interests of foreign investors, you will, of course, by definition, discourage investment. Investors will flee for the hills. So a lot of how this all works out, in our view, is going to depend more on your domestic economic policy settings than anything else. Well, there are a whole lot of issues that we wouldn't touch, like how much money should you pay to the EU. They obviously are trying to get as much money out of the UK as they possibly can to avoid there being a hole in their budget. So we wouldn't offer any useful commentary on that. We don't have to pay the bill, so it's easy for us to stand aside. For us, the one thing we don't want to see is the erection of tariffs and quotas between the UK and the EU, because if that is to happen, that will not only inhibit economic growth in the UK, but in the EU as a whole as well, but it will have an effect on the global economy, and it will have a negative effect. I mean, the UK, I notice people in the EU saying, well, the UK is smaller than the EU. Well, the whole of the EU put together, it's smaller. But the UK is the world's 5th largest economy. And if you have, at the moment, free trade and then decide to erect a whole lot of barriers with the world's 5th biggest economy, that's going to be bad for the global economy. So we don't want to see that happen. The nature of the free trade agreement doesn't really matter very much to us, excepting to say this. If the UK remains in the customs union in an unqualified way, in total remains in the customs union, then it would be very difficult for the UK to negotiate any trade agreements. So for us to negotiate a free trade agreement with the UK, that would actually have to be a trade agreement with the EU. And we are beginning negotiations with the EU, but we have already discovered that those negotiations are going to be a long and winding road. So we perhaps could negotiate quite quickly a free trade agreement with the UK if the UK was not in the customs union. We're a bit cautious in what we say about this, but accepting to say, you know, we can survive without a free trade agreement with the UK because we don't have one now. But if you remain in the customs union, then you won't be able, presumably, to negotiate free trade agreements with other countries around the world. What will happen is you'll leave the EU, which will actually only mean that you no longer have any voting rights in the European Council, but still the trading arrangements will remain the same. I don't know how comfortable people in the UK would feel about that, and that's not a matter for us. Well, they're so deep and so strong. I mean, of course, we have stronger, for obvious demographic reasons, we have closer cultural ties with the UK than almost any other country in the world, and you with Australia. And for example, we play in the main the same sports. You don't play Australian football, but we're just about to begin the Ashes series, and you know there's huge interest in that here, as there is in Australia. Everyone's very excited about it, and you know we all tease each other, and I don't know, for some reason or other, in the end, we're very good-natured about it. Sometimes we win, sometimes you win, as I'm speaking to you, we are literally on the eve of the Australia-England game at Twickenham. You know, we enjoy those sorts of things. I've never really agreed with the proposition put to me once by somebody in Australia that you can't take seriously countries that can't play cricket, because, you know, I really do take America seriously, but and China and so on. But the fact that we play cricket says something about the huge bond there is between us, and that we are so interested in it and we take it so seriously. It's an interesting link. So perhaps if the EU countries played cricket, then you would have remained in the EU. Who knows? That may be the secret to the Brexit vote.
Exporting cricket more widely worldwide. That'd be a good diplomatic mission to be a part of.
Yeah, I think with T20 cricket, you might find that will catch on more broadly around the world. Actually, I'm not. I know purists watching this are now going to condemn me and go on Twitter and say, well, there's only one real cricket, and that's Test match cricket, and every Test match needs to last for 5 days. But T20, it's very popular. Well, look, here is a perspective of mine, which is that in the UK, we look for clarity on what your trade policy is going to be once you leave the EU. I mean, are you going to be a free trading country? And Liam Fox and others have said the answer to that is yes. So what does that actually mean? Are you going to be ridding yourselves of tariffs and quotas, and as we did, by the way, through the 80s and the 90s. And so you're going to be a wonderful partner for free trading countries like Australia if you do that. And equally, when it comes to this whole issue of immigration, I think it's fair to say, in a general sense, we find it quite hard to understand what your immigration policy really is. And I don't wish to be rude about it, but we have a planned migration system. So we have categories of people who are able to come, the terms on which they can come to Australia, and we decide who comes to Australia and the circumstances in which they come. And if you put together a coherent immigration policy like that, that will make it much easier for us to negotiate with you some reciprocal arrangements. I mean, we have a universal visa system. We're not going to get rid of that. And we're not going to make an exception from our universal visa system for anyone. Even technically, New Zealand is involved in, is subject to that system. But we could look at ways of freeing up movement between our countries of business people, professionals, academics. You know, maybe you could get more Australian nurses working here more easily into your National Health Service. More Australian doctors, British doctors, nurses could go and work in Australia. Mutual recognition of qualifications for lawyers as well. So we could simplify some of the arrangements that we currently have. I mean, you can do these things, but it's quite complicated. We could simplify those arrangements and make for greater mobility between Australia and the UK. We already have a lot of British people coming to Australia, though. We have, off the top of my head, I think we have about 17,000 British migrants a year, people who come permanently to settle in Australia. Then we have people from the UK who come on temporary work visas. That's for 2 to 4 years. We'd have 7,000 or 8,000 of them come a year. We have some students who come from the UK to study in Australia. So all sorts of people from the UK come to Australia, so they're welcome. And we'd like to feel Australians are welcome here. I mean, at the personal level, Australians are incredibly welcome here, but you know, just keep the welcome mat out there when you leave the EU.
Absolutely.
We foreigners, you know, we have to queue up at the others line at Heathrow or Gatwick or wherever, whereas, you know, the Germans and the Italians and Greeks and so on, they go into the sort of home line. So I guess that's noticed by Australians. Whereas if you're British, have a British passport, and you arrive at an Australian airport, you're able to use the Smart Gate, the electronic visa system, electronic passport system. Just swipe your passport and through you go, if you're British. So we offer you a better service than you offer us. Well, I always like to go up to the immigration officers and say to them, you know, I know that's where the EU citizens go, but where do we foreigners go? And I think people in the UK regard the concept of Australians being sort of deeply foreign as rather absurd. And it is, by the way, rather absurd. But I like to describe myself here as a foreigner, just to remind you of how we queue with the others, with the Chinese and the Japanese and the people from Burkina Faso, all worthy and good people, and the Germans and the Finns and the Italians and Austrians. They all go through the other queue. Fair enough. That's just the way you've made your life.
Yeah, and I can imagine how that must feel.
Well, it's not a problem for me or for my children, but for my father, who fought for the Australian Imperial Force in the Second World War, and who was a prisoner of the Japanese for 3.5 years, as a result of the total incompetence of all of us to defend Singapore. We have to take full responsibility for that jointly. But anyway, he was just, it made him cry that he was regarded as an alien coming to the UK. I fought in the Second World War for the British Empire, and but for him, but you know, for my generation, life's moved on. That goes without saying. London is Europe's largest city and Europe's most dynamic city. London, in many respects, is the capital of the world. I mean, nobody in Australia is thinking, oh, I won't go to London anymore. I think instead I'll go to Bologna or Barcelona. I mean, exactly. It makes you smile even to think of it. They're great places, Bologna and Barcelona. Barcelona is in a little bit of turmoil at the moment. But, you know, don't get me wrong. I'm not being critical of these places. But London is a great sort of epicenter of the world. It's where the world meets. And the city, I mean, you know, people talk about the city of London being replaced somehow as the world's, certainly Europe's greatest financial centre, but the world's greatest financial centre. It's the world's largest financial centre. The second largest is New York, and then the next largest are cities like Tokyo and Hong Kong, Singapore, even Sydney. And the EU financial centres are much smaller, much smaller. I think actually Luxembourg is the largest EU financial centre. So I don't mean Luxembourg is obviously not a very big city, but Luxembourg as a financial centre is minuscule compared to London. I mean, some people may or may not, I don't know, move out of London, but the Australian banks aren't thinking of closing in London and, you know, opening in Palermo instead. They're going to stay in London. Why London? One, it's got the momentum. It's already a huge financial centre, so all the expertise is here. Two, the legal system here is by far the best legal system for business in Europe. And that includes the way insolvency and restructuring law operates. I can't tell you how important it is for business to operate in an environment where not only is a contract's properly honoured and supported in the courts, and the courts seem to be entirely independent, but where there is a simple and straightforward insolvency and restructuring law, or series of laws. And the UK just has a huge advantage over other jurisdictions in that respect. Well, I think you are, I'm almost never say anything critical of Britain or the British people, and my wife is British. Therefore my children are dual nationals and my mother-in-law is British. So what I would say is I think as a people you're a bit pessimistic. Whereas you go to a country like Australia or America and there is that sort of enthusiastic optimism. We have an expression in Australia when things go wrong, and don't you worry, things go wrong in Australia from time to time. We have an expression, she'll be right. She'll be right, mate. And I think you should take that approach to Brexit. Yeah, look, nearly half of you didn't want it to happen. So you're thinking that's bad. Those people are probably looking for signs which will reinforce the way they voted. So it's just human nature. They will be looking for things that are going wrong and they'll mainly attribute them to Brexit. I suppose the Brexiteers are the reverse. They're looking for things that are going right and attribute them to Brexit. But there's another old saying that nothing in politics is ever as good or as bad as it seems. And your success through the Brexit process will depend much more on how well you manage your own economy and how you manage your internal affairs, much more on that than anything else. If I could plant a thought, it is that you need to have an endless and enthusiastic and engaging debate on macro and microeconomic policy rather than just focusing on what are the trading arrangements going to be with, you know, countries that range from France and Germany and the Netherlands, which in trading terms really matter to you, and Slovakia and Romania and Bulgaria, which I'm sure matter, but don't matter quite so much.